You know it's darkest before the dawn. This thought keeps me moving on. If we could heed these early warnings, the time is now, quite early morning. If we could heed these early warnings, the time is now, quite early morning.
Good morning. This is Environmental Studies 144, Blood and Oil, Energy, the Middle East, and the War. Sorry I missed the first day, but I imagine we'll make up for it in the days ahead. This is not a feel-good class. This is not a class about wonderful things, but it is a class about very important things. It is a class about things that have been going on for a very long time and things that are still going on. It's a class that is really designed to do two things for you educationally. The first is to help you in a project that's given in the epigram to the Syllabus by the great, dark Irish playwright Samuel Beckett, who said, "The confusion is not my invention. The darkness is all around, and our only chance is to let it in. Our only chance of renovation is to open our eyes and see the mess." That is, this is a class in overcoming denial. There is a vast amount of denial in this society and in others about the nature of the situation in which all of us find ourselves. This is, to put it mildly, a very unlovely situation, and it is also a situation that, while in its details is new, is also very old. More than about 143 years ago, the famous British poet Matthew Arnold concluded a poem for his time that seems very appropriate for where we are now. On a darkling plain swept with confused alarms of struggle and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night. Just think about the ignorant armies clashing at this very moment in the country of Afghanistan. On one side, you have a motley crew that we in the West are pleased to call the Taliban, or the students, a social movement that emerged out of a ghastly and violent history of that poor, benighted country, mainly staffed by young men who, at best, can write their own name. They qualify as ignorant. But on the other side, there is plenty of ignorance to go around. On the other side, we find the American Armed Forces, spokesmen for which have repeatedly announced to us just yesterday or the day before in the press, there's a new report by a general about how very little we and our troops there understand just what in the world is going on here. Ignorant armies are clashing by night, and this matters. Trillions of dollars are being spent on these activities, and as anyone who's sat through the first week of economics knows, those funds have opportunity costs. There are alternative uses for that money. So what we're interested in is trying to figure out, how did we get here? How can we understand this mess? Because only if we have some understanding do we have any chance of doing anything about it. Our only chance of renovation is to open our eyes and to see the mess. So what are we looking at here? We are looking above all at connections. This class is very much a multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary social science class. We need to make connections. The boundaries between disciplines are decidedly unhelpful for the subject matter of this class, and I tend to ignore them much as I have ignored them throughout my career. Although I've been trained as an economist, I'm also a political analyst and have spent most of my life studying history, sociology, and the like. So we're going to look at the interactions among oil production and consumption, Middle Eastern and American politics, and wars. We are looking at a very, very deadly intersection. It's not like these wars have just begun. They've been going on for a long time, and it is, to put it mildly, a part of the world and a process that is complicated. So now let me make a warning and make a statement about the nature of this class. As you can tell by looking at the syllabus, this is not a class for the lazy. It is a syllabus of over 10 pages. By the way, if you don't have one, you can download it from eRes. I'll give you the password in just a second. Oh, it's very easy. The password is the very hard to remember, blood and oil, lowercase. I don't expect you to read everything on the reading list, but I expect you to be adults and to use it to try to learn as much as you can. The more you know, the less likely you are to be led astray. The more you know, the easier it is for you to deconstruct your own mind. Why is that important? That's important because all of us, without exception, we think we're sort of these autonomous people that really are all on our own and we're independent and separated, but actually how we think has been very deeply shaped by our parents, our community, the kind of training we got before, all of these ideas that very much come from the society we live in, which for most of us is the United States. Like every other place in the world, the United States has a history, and that history has shaped not only its institutions, but also the way we think. I'm going to argue that many of the elements of the way we think are decidedly unhelpful for understanding this part of the world. I'm going to talk about that a little bit today. So part of the task is deconstructing, taking apart our own minds, taking apart the kind of things that we think are normal. They're not normal. They're produced by history just like everything else is, and we have to try to understand them. So how are we going to do this? We're going to draw on economics, certainly, both in terms of the economics of development and in terms of fiscal issues and in terms very much of the political economy of the global petroleum market. None of this can be understood without politics. We must talk about politics, and we're going to talk about politics extensively. We'll also draw on sociology. This is necessary, as we'll see, to make sense out of what is going on, psychology, and above all, history. Literary critics argue about who was America's greatest novelist. Maybe it was Herman Melville, but certainly in the 20th century, William Faulkner might be the one. This is something always to remember. The past is not dead. In fact, it is not even past. Things, as we will see in this class, that happened decades, even centuries ago, live on because actions have consequences, and those consequences can reverberate forever. To take one very simple example, decisions made in desperation in chancelleries in Berlin and even more in France, in Paris and London during World War I, nearly 100 years ago, continue not to be dead. Indeed, they are not even past in terms of understanding the kind of violence that we see on the TV news every day emanating from this region. So we're going to have to do history. We're going to think about history in a very particular way. We're going to think about it analytically. This is not about great men, although sometimes great men and not so great men will matter. But it is about understanding the forces, the consequences of human behavior and human action. Now, of course, there are many ways of looking at these issues, and I have a particular way of doing this. The British philosopher Thomas Nagel once wrote a famous essay called The View from Nowhere, arguing that, of course, there is no such thing as the view from nowhere. Everybody has a perspective, and so do I. Let me just say a few things about that perspective, and of course, you'll probably have more than your fill of that perspective come March 15th. All right. I've been studying the Middle East since 1966. That is, about 44 years ago, which is, given typical demographics, roughly twice as long as the vast majority of you in this room have been alive. I've been thinking about this for a long time. I've worked on it academically. I've worked for the United States government. I've worked for the United Nations. I've traveled from Morocco to Indonesia, from Kazakhstan to Nigeria. I've been all over that part of the world, and I've thought about it over and over and over again. Most of my published work has been about this subject. Some of it you'll read, a book called The Political Economy of the Middle East. Don't worry. I know it's very expensive if you look at it on Amazon. And I know that you at UCSC are being hammered by one increase over another, so you will not have to buy that book. I will put a copy of all the chapters you need to read on electronic reserve, so you don't have to pay for it at all. What have I learned in all this time? Lots of things, but one thing to me stands out. History always matters. And history is fundamentally tragic. It seems to me that we human beings very much fit the description of St. Paul. We see at best through a glass darkly. This is not very surprising. We are sort of big primates with a big brain, with a high opinion of ourselves that really seems most out of place. We grasp at unattainable certainties repeatedly. Right? Maybe this is hardwired. We fall prey to ill-defined fears, and then, all too often, we lapse repeatedly into spasms of dark and murderous rage. And we're going to look at this directly. We are not turning away from any of this. The history of primates like us, really, when you think about it, couldn't fail to be tragic. Right? We act as we do, thinking that we do so for noble reasons, even as we all too often produce squalid and vicious outcomes, and then we catch our breath and prepare to do it all over again. What am I talking about? Well, many things, indeed the whole of human history, but just to take one very current example. We have had a brutal and bloody war in Iraq. We are enmeshed now in a brutal and bloody war in Afghanistan, and given this idiot who tried to put explosives in his underpants, there are now people talking about, well, maybe we should go into the country of Yemen. Having been to Yemen, trust me, don't go there. Just before Christmas, the New York Times op-ed page carried a piece by a prominent political scientist at the University of Texas at Austin calling for the United States to bomb Iran. So we are far from having gotten away from all of this. We make a mess, we fall down, we pick ourselves up, and then we prepare to do it all over again. It seems to me we might be able to do better than this. One way to think about history is to join one of the greatest prose writers in the English language, Sir Edward Gibbon, who more than 200 years ago wrote a 3,100-page book called The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. He had this to say: history is little more than the register of the crimes, the follies, and the misfortunes of mankind, and we're going to look at this. Take something else from a long time ago. Here's a man, you'll learn more about him later when we talk about state formation. He was the Prime Minister of Sweden, the confidant of the king, during a brutal and bloody period of European history called the 30 Years' War. As he lay dying on his bed, he said to his son, "Know, my son, with how little wisdom the world is governed." 350 years later, unfortunately, this remains true. So what are the implications of this view? The first is, there are no villains here. There's much villainy, to be sure, but there are no villains. There are also no heroes, although there is occasional heroism. They're just ordinary people, just like us, making a comprehensive mess of things, whether in Washington, D.C., in Kabul, in Tehran, or in Palestine and Israel. The crucial thing to understand: do not think about history as a morality play. This is not about good guys and bad guys, about white hats and black hats. It's about people who are desperate, who do not understand very much, trying their best, and nevertheless making a comprehensive mess out of things. If we think about it, we are really not so different from such people. My own view is that what we as the United States have been doing does not display the right stuff, a la Tom Cruise, but the wrong stuff. This is a photo from 1991, Gulf War. It still is true today. And there is a kind of modern tragedy going on, which is what this class is about, what we're trying to understand. We are fighting wars that we cannot win. Indeed, it is not even obvious what winning means. After all, we fought this long war in Iraq, large, and now we hear very little about this. President Obama, very much to his credit, is trying to get troops out of there. And what will remain? What will remain is a regime that is, as anyone would have known, as all of us did know, as we told the government, as we warned them, we were hardly alone. Well, what will happen is a regime dominated by men who adhere to a modern ideology known as Islamism, of a very particular kind, Shia Islamism. That is to say, close allies of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And this is the reason why we fought this big war. So a very, very odd thing to do. What does the war in Afghanistan mean? Well, just wait, we'll get there. Okay? And again, these are wars where it's not even clear what winning might mean. Interestingly, none of it is necessary. We do not need to be doing any of it. There are statements, oh, well, we have to do it because of energy supplies. As we will see, this is rubbish. It's bad economics, worse politics, and utterly ahistorical and silly. Oh, see, people say, well, we have to do it because of our strategic position. Yeah, well, this is also extremely dubious. So the tragedy is in part that all these people are being killed, and all this treasure is being wasted, and it is for nothing. Nothing. This is not to say that the people who are motivated to do this do not have goals. They do. It is not to say that the people who are in charge of this do not have sets of beliefs. They do. But it is to say that as we look at this more closely, we will see that there is a way in which there is a deep, in the philosophical sense, absurdity of what is going on. And this is part of the deconstruction process that we need to be looking at. Hundreds of thousands of people, human beings just like you and just like me, are now dead as a result of these delusions that we have embraced, and delusions which people in the region have embraced. Nobody knows how many Iraqis were killed, but hundreds of thousands is a reasonable guess. Millions of them have been made homeless, they have been wounded, thanks to the hubris, the greed, and the ignorance of our leaders and to forces in the region. One of the oldest Christian communities on the planet, the Iraqi Christian community, almost has ceased to exist. People have fled or are in sort of hiding and internal exile. This was not necessarily the kind of outcome that we hoped for. Not only, then, is what we are doing deeply destructive, but they are also a grotesque distraction from what we ought to be worrying about, which is the looming environmental crisis on the planet in terms of biodiversity and global climate change. Here's a statement by a prominent British journalist, a man named Jonathan Freedman. His guess about how historians in the century that you will live most of your adult lives are going to look at these times we've been living in, a distraction. When we should have been worried about climate change, instead we were worried about wars. It's also true that it may be that we'll decide that this is the period when the power of the United States, which has dominated the globe since 1945, has begun to decline and begun to wane. This is inevitable. All empires rise and all empires decline. There have been in history no exceptions to this. There is no reason whatsoever to imagine that the United States will be freed from these kinds of historical imperatives. So we've been distracted. We've been doing what we shouldn't be doing and not doing what we ought to be doing. And of course, there has been a great deal of talk about the whole thing. And as I'm going to argue in here, most of this talk is, to put it mildly, absurd. And that matters, because the great philosophe Voltaire was right. People who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. And that's exactly what's been going on. Let's start with an absurdity, just one. I kind of was in that kind of mood, over coffee, making the PowerPoint slide, and I said, well, gosh, what a wealth of material I have here. I just pick one. I picked this one. This is Admiral Mullen. He's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And he was asked why the United States hadn't gone into the federally administrated tribal areas, that's what FATA stands for, in Pakistan. Although we knew that Al-Qaeda was there. And he said, Pakistan's we don't go into sovereign countries. The journalist didn't say a thing. I mean, it would be as if I got up here and said, I play for the Los Angeles Lakers. No, I don't think so. Not at 63, only 6 feet. Old men don't play. Short old men don't play for the LA Lakers, right? I mean, it just doesn't happen. The United States has repeatedly invaded sovereign countries, and we've done so very recently. We've invaded Iraq, we've invaded Afghanistan, and we talk about invading others, and we invaded others in the past. So this is an absurdity, and I didn't make this up. So absurdities like this happen all the time, and we know what the atrocities look like. The great philosopher Hannah Arendt wrote a book called Eichmann in Jerusalem, about Eichmann, the SS officer in charge of the logistics for the Holocaust. And the subtitle was The Banality of Evil. Evil is not, Hollywood notwithstanding, the kind of thing that arises out of some really dark, horned beings that are fundamentally separate from us, but instead out of just ordinary folks. Notice the example to digital hygiene there. He's cleaning his fingernails, a very prosaic thing, while this guy is being tortured. Those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. The good news is, it doesn't have to be like this. This man, Czesław Miłosz, famous Polish poet and resistor to the Stalinist regime in Poland, said this: one thing is, we think that because things have been a certain way, they will necessarily continue to be that way. But we then overlook people who do something else and cause something different to happen. This is possible. it is possible for us to do better than this. So, although the material in this class is reasonably dark, that's really part of getting out of denial. As anyone who knows anything about addiction knows, the very first step in overcoming addiction of any kind is to drop the denial that you're hooked. We have to drop the denial that we're hooked on petroleum, drop the denial that we're hooked on war, drop the denial that we're hooked on a whole series of ideas and concepts that really aren't very helpful now. They might have been helpful once, but they certainly aren't useful now. We've got to start there, but we don't stop there. We've got to go on from there to think about, okay, what else can be done? How can we think about this differently? And what can be done? So what am I asking you to do in here? Pretty simple. First, there are 2 written assignments. They're on the syllabus. They go out on Tuesday, January 26th. They come back a week later. And the way this works is that each of these essays, notice it's the same question. This is deliberate. Because what we're going to be doing is looking at successive takes, successive layers of analysis, as a way of trying to understand, to broaden and deepen our understanding of this fundamental question. In what sense, if any, do we, the United States, shed blood for oil? Okay? Then there is a third requirement, which is a term paper. And this term paper can be one of 2 things. It can either be your third and final take on this basic question, which in the past has been the option that most students have elected, or it can be something else altogether. Some subject that really moves you, that really interests you. In that case, come to me and talk to me, and that'll be fine. How do you come to me? And oh yeah, this is due Monday, March 15th. Now, this is it, ladies and gentlemen. This class is it, as far as I'm concerned. I retired in July. I'm gone after March 15th. So, when it comes to extensions, don't go there. Office hours. Wednesday, 2:30 to 4. My office is in room 430 in the Interdisciplinary Science Building. Come see me to talk about anything at all you care about. Reserves. Books. There are a lot of books. Books are on reserve, on 2-hour reserve at the Science Library. And here's the electronic reserves. All PowerPoint slideshows will be on reserve, plus a variety of other things will be on electronic reserve so you can read them. You just go to the Science Library webpage, you go to this class, or you can use my name. There are different ways to search. The password is, as I say, the difficult to remember, blood and oil. Okay, and you will get everything you need there. Hopefully already up there are several things. First of all, the syllabus is there. If you didn't get a syllabus, you can get it there. There also are a series of files of maps. The great American writer, Ambrose Bierce, a Civil War veteran who died mysteriously after going down to join the Mexican Revolution in 1910. Nobody ever found his body or found his grave. Nobody knows what happens to him. He once said, "War is God's way of teaching Americans geography." Now, it's like this with respect to the Middle East. This is not a simple place. And you simply can't understand anything unless you know the basic geography. There are various options. Go to this webpage, download some of these maps, carry these maps around with you. If you don't know the geography already, learn it now. Okay? You simply can't make any sense out of the different kind of strategic relationships and the kinds of stuff we're going to talk about unless you know it. So that's the first thing. There are a couple of sets of maps for you to look at. Then there is another map atlas about one of the central conflicts in the region. The tragedy of the Palestinian and the Israelis. Understanding, having some grasp of the dimensions of this, is a necessary, although not sufficient, condition for making any sense at all out of this part of the world. Thinking about actions having consequences, there was just today on the AP Wire a story about this Jordanian double agent, or maybe triple agent, or maybe not an agent, or maybe he didn't do it, you know, that kind of thing, who was the bomber at the CIA base in Afghanistan. His brother said he was a Jordanian, that is to say, that's his passport. He was a Palestinian, and he was very, very angry about what had happened a year ago in Gaza. Actions have consequences. These things go on, and the point is to make connections, connect the dots, and there are a lot of dots to connect. So there's a short reference atlas for you to look at. So what does the syllabus look like? Well, first, some preliminaries. That's today. And then we have to do some background work. As I say, this class is, among other things, designed to help you think not just about the Middle East, but about anything you care about. Let's say you cared about the economic policy of the People's Republic of China, and, well, you might be interested in this. How to think about this? Turns out you need to understand the motives of the hierarchy of the Communist Party of China, and to do this you must understand some of their history and understand some of the dynamics that we're going to be talking about in a different context. We have to understand what has sometimes been called the two great games. One game is the game of nations, the competition between different nation states, the kinds of conflicts that they embark upon, and that's one thing we have to understand. The second one, that interacts with the first, is the great game of what is called the Great Transformation, that I'm going to lecture about more in just a minute. This huge, wrenching, fundamental transition that the United States went through a number of years ago, and that every place in the world has gone through, the transition from a society of farmers and peasants and illiterates living in the countryside, ruled by priests and warriors, to a society much like our own, of literate, urban people working in industry and services with much more complex governance structures. This transformation has taken place in Europe. It has taken place in North America. It is taking place in East Asia, and it is well underway in the rest of the world. Everywhere in the world that this transformation has taken place, it has generated appalling and fearful violence. We will see that this is very important in terms of understanding the Middle East. I'm going to argue in a minute. The violence we see in the Middle East is not at all exceptional. Not because of the Middle East, but because of this transformation. We should not expect Middle Easterners to do better than Europeans, Americans, Chinese, or Japanese have done, and they haven't. So we're going to talk about these two great games. Then we're going to talk about the oil market. A great deal of nonsense is written about the oil market. There's all kinds of statements. And we're going to go through this using straightforward economic analysis and also politics, because, as it turns out, on both the demand but especially on the supply side, many of the critical actors are nation states. And nation states aren't firms. They behave differently from firms. They have different interests, and so there's no choice but to look at this in a political economy framework. And we're going to look at this transformation that is taking place in the Middle East right now. This is critical. Without understanding this, we can't understand what's going on. And then, equipped with this background, we're going to do some case studies. We're going to look at Saudi Arabia, which holds probably a quarter of all the petroleum on the planet. We're going to look at Iran, Afghanistan, and Iraq as a way of trying to tie together and make sense out of what we've looked at so far. Let me say a little more about modes of thinking. how to think about this problem, or indeed any other kind of problem. The first thing to get rid of is the notion that we're going somewhere. We, that is, humans. We're not going anywhere. But we don't think this in this country. We think we're moving forward to a shining goal. The perspective that I favor is that history has no goal. Liberal ideologues, Marxist ideologues, equally, in my judgment, are wrong. We're not going anywhere. This notion that we're going somewhere has deep roots in Western thinking. The origins lie in Christianity, but then it was developed considerably in a secular guise after the French Revolution, and you can read about this in the book Black Mass, Apocalyptic Religion and the Death of Utopia by the British political philosopher John Gray, that's on the reading list. This perspective pervades liberal thinking, right? We're all going to a shining future of capitalist democracy. Or Marxist thinking, we're all going to a shining future of variously socialism, dictatorship of the proletariat, depends on the kind of Marxist. Yeah, we're going somewhere. Well, I prefer the view of the ancient Greeks, or the Romans, Hindus, Chinese, Buddhists, and Charles Darwin, that we're not going anywhere. It's not the way it works. History isn't like that. Evolution isn't like that, whether at the natural level or at the social level. Thinking teleologically is a huge error. And it's really easy to do, because that's the way we unconsciously think as Americans. We need to get rid of this. There is, of course, progress in technology, no question, in the sense of our ability to understand and manipulate the natural order, no question that there's progress in that sense. But Albert Einstein, the greatest scientist of the 20th century, said that technological progress with humans was like putting an axe in the hands of a pathological criminal. I mean, there's the good news, but then there's the bad news. There's not a lot of evidence. There's a little bit, but not a lot of evidence of progress that I can see in any ethical sense. We humans now, like humans before, are driven by forces that one tradition, the Buddhist tradition, calls greed, hatred, and delusion. The Tibetans even have a little symbol for it. Here's greed, the pig, holding the tail of the rooster for greed, who holds the tail of the snake for hatred, and they whirl around and around and around, propelling human life and human death. And a secular way of interpreting this is that these forces, the forces of greed, and when greed is thwarted, particularly greed for power is thwarted, the reaction is rage, which leads to hatred, which leads to violence, which then sets up another cycle, and around and around and around we go. Come back to that in a minute. Let me just say a few things. Here's a sketch, of kind of the way I think. It's there. You can read it. It's that American Thinking About Violence in the Middle East. It's on the syllabus. It's online. You can read it. Let me just give you a brief summary of it. Because in a way, it's kind of like, those artist sketches before they do big paintings. The big painting is this class, and the lens sketch is that little essay. What's wrong with the way we think? We make 5 fundamental cognitive errors about this. The first is we, like most people, indulge in revenge. Many of you may be too young to remember what happened right after 9/11, 2001. But the rhetoric from otherwise sensible men and women was absolutely blood-curdling. There was a notion that we should go out and kill these people. A former Secretary of State, Lawrence Eagleburger, said, well, the solution is just go kill the bastards. That's a quote. This is not the kind of language you normally expect of diplomats. We thought that because all of a sudden, seemingly out of nowhere, it was very much not out of nowhere, a horrific criminal act of violence has been committed, that therefore we should turn around and do it. This is very human. Some psychologists think it's hardwired in us for evolutionary reasons. It may be that it contributes to our survival, but it certainly doesn't make us happy, and it certainly isn't the way forward in international affairs. But that's the way we reacted. Instead of reacting to the criminal outrage of 9/11 by saying, this is a criminal outrage, and therefore what we should do is go out and deal with this as a crime, and enlist the support of the whole world, people thronged the streets of Tehran with candles, mourning for the victims of 9/11. But instead, for reasons we will look at with some care, we chose to do something else. We chose to launch a whole series of wars. Part of this was just pure old gut-level revenge, giving in to our worst instincts. But of course, like other people, we don't like to think that when we indulge in revenge, that's really what we're doing. This is generally true. If you notice, for example, reports about other wars that may not concern Americans so greatly, and you read reports, what will you find? You'll find reports about people saying, well, we did this because we're right and they're wrong. Right? This is what I call John Wayne mind. The kind of mind of black hats and white hats, bad people and good people. There's this notion of our own unique righteousness, and therefore the flip side of that is other people's own and unique evil. This is an extremely powerful and profoundly dangerous delusion. 2,500 years ago, the Buddha said, hatred never ceases by hatred, but only by not hating. This is the eternal law. Less than a generation ago, the great Russian novelist and dissident Alexander Solzhenitsyn said, if only it were so simple, if only all we had to do was to round up all the bad people and separate them from us, then everything would be fine. But, said Solzhenitsyn, the line separating good and evil runs through the heart of every human being. This notion that some people, some nations, some groups have a monopoly on virtue and other nations, other groups, other people have a monopoly on evil is profoundly dangerous and destructive. We all have to be on our guard against this, the temptation of this mode of thought, because it is always productive of massive suffering, particularly when carried out on a social and political level. That's the second problem. Third problem we Americans have is, to put it bluntly, we don't do history. We don't do it. There are deep historical reasons why we don't. After all, if you think about it, with the exception of Native Americans and African Americans, most of the ancestors of the rest of us came here precisely trying to get away from history. I mean, who wanted the history of miserable, starving villages in the northern, in the uplands of Italy? Who wanted to remember the history of mass death in the Irish potato famine, like my ancestors? Who wanted to remember, and on and on and on? Right? So the whole idea is we can start all over again. We have this deep idea that everybody can always remake himself. We can start all over. Now, it's true that we can make choices and do things differently. That is true. But it is also true that we always do this in a context created by history. And to ignore this is to invite disaster, as we've seen over and over again. Let me give you a really simple example. I know that on the eve of the Anglo-American invasion of Iraq in the spring of 2003, that everyone I know, after a career of studying the region, a career that included connections to the American government, Every single person that I knew and respected was aghast at the notion of what we were doing. The idea was, how can they do this? This is so stupid. As Chas Freeman, a famous diplomat who opposed the war, who had been the former ambassador to Saudi Arabia during the first Gulf War, and then the ambassador to the People's Republic of China, who speaks, no mean feat, fluent Arabic and Mandarin, said, well, we invaded the Iraq of our imaginations and fears not the Iraq that actually exists. Why? Because we ignored history. Everyone knew, oh, why are we doing this? Handing the great, if Iran is indeed an adversary, and there are reasons to think this, although reasons not to, surely invading and destroying Iran's greatest regional enemy, Saddam Hussein, was unlikely to be productive of the kind of outcome we wanted. Everybody I knew thought this. We said so. We were ignored. We were laughed at. We were called traitors, and so on. So ignoring history is something that we do, and every time it comes around and bites us and kills young men and women who are Americans who've joined the armed forces, not to mention even many more people who are killed abroad. So ignoring history is a very bad idea, and we're not going to do that. We're going to look at a lot of history, because history would also have suggested to us, as we're going to see in this class, something that a point I just made earlier. The violence in the Middle East is not, underlined, not exceptional historically. It is, on the contrary, exactly what we should expect, given the history of the region and given the stresses of these two great transformations, which every place else in the world they have happened, have led to events that read like a horror novel. Think of Europe. World War I, the horrors of the trenches, the rise of Bolshevism, the rise of Joseph Stalin, the coming to power of the madman Adolf Hitler with his lunatic ideology, murderously killing millions of people. All of this cannot be understood without understanding these twin transformations. Think of East Asia. How about the Japanese invasion of China? How about Nanjing? How about the horrors of the Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward in China? All of these things. Massive violence. Again, what we would expect, given the challenges, the difficulties, and the deep dislocations that these kinds of transformations involve. And what about us? Well, try the treatment of the African Americans. Try slavery, Jim Crow, sharecropping, lynchings, not to mention the Civil War, when the whole population of the country was about 31 million, something like 500,000 men died, and many more than that were wounded for life. These transformations are bloody and violent and traumatic everywhere. This matters. Once we think about it historically, then we no longer look at what goes on as being so exceptional, and that helps us look for ways to mitigate this kind of violence, to find a better way to do it, and to try to have a little less. So ignoring history is a third. There's a fourth one. Rejecting paradox. We don't like to think that two stories that are fundamentally at variance with each other can both be true. But, in fact, this is often the way it is. The leading paradox that matters here is the two very different, equally true, and contradictory stories. One, the story of the Israelis, and two, the story of the Palestinians. The story of the Israelis is fairly clear. Jews in Europe were excluded during a period of the rise of nationalism in the late 19th century, and we'll look at this in detail later. They were excluded. German Jews weren't regarded as Germans. Hungarian Jews weren't regarded as Hungarians. Romanian Jews weren't regarded as Romanians. Ukrainian Jews weren't regarded as Ukrainians, and so forth. Not surprisingly, when everybody else is embracing this ideology of nationalism, don't worry if you don't know what that is, never mind, we'll get there. Okay? We'll look at this in detail, it's crucial. Unsurprisingly, there emerged a Jewish nationalism. The name of this Jewish nationalism was Zionism. That's what it was, a kind of nationalism. Right? And also not surprising that this nationalism, like every other nationalism, all nationalisms are created. They're constructions. They're historically produced. They're not essences. And whenever these things are produced, the process of producing it always draws on stories from the old world, of the past. So unsurprisingly, the story of Jewish nationalism involved the return to Palestine. Then you throw into this the grotesque treatment of Jews throughout Europe, culminating in the horrors of the Holocaust, and it's hardly surprising that so many Jews all over the world, and many of their sympathizers all over the world, think of Israel as a perfectly legitimate form of nationalism and a nation-state. This is a story that is true. And there is a second story that is equally true. From the perspective of the Palestinians, Israel was and remains a settler colonial state. There are a number of settler colonial states. We live in one of them. The United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. These are places where Europeans left Europe and then went somewhere else. And when they did this, the treatment of the locals was typically not lovely. They were expropriated. They were kicked out. Now, in the previous mention, in the United States, in Canada, in New Zealand, and in Australia, most of the peoples were non-literate. But this was certainly very much not the case with the Palestinians. From the very beginning of the Zionist project, at the beginning of the 20th century, when Palestine was still part of the Ottoman Empire, the Palestinians, as soon as they figured out what was up, protested against this. They continued to protest and continue to protest to this day, saying, look, we're here. And what is this about this land doesn't belong to us? We've been here a really long time and now you're kicking us out. In 1948, in what the Israelis call the First War of Independence, which the Palestinians called the Nakba, or the catastrophe, something like 720,000 Palestinians out of a population of about 1,300,000 were forcibly expelled from the land. These people's descendants today number perhaps 4 million, whether they're in Lebanon or Jordan or Syria or all over the world, and they have forgotten very, very little. So from a Palestinian perspective, from an Arab perspective, from a Muslim perspective, Israel is a settler colonial state. And that is a story which is equally true. Now, we Americans just can't stand this. In fact, most people can't stand this. We can't stand the notion that there are two stories that are kind of in fundamental conflict with each other, both of which are true. This is the way the world works. Okay? So to understand this, and understanding this, this class is not about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but without some sideward glances at it, nothing in the Middle East can make sense, including, as we'll see, the history of oil prices. You can no more understand the history of international oil prices without understanding the role of wars between the Israelis and the Palestinians than you can understand the prices of agricultural products in the United States without taking into account the policies of the United States federal government. It is quite impossible. So rejecting paradox, we don't want to do this. And then last, but unfortunately not least, there is something called, that I call Thomas Edison mind. And this is the delusion of, quote-unquote, solutions. You might have noticed that when I was talking about the Israelis and the Palestinians, I didn't then put it all together by saying, well, so here's the solution. Think of it this way. History is not an engineering problem. Now, we Americans don't like this. Because just as we ignore history and don't think about it and don't like it, on the contrary, we're great engineers, right? We're really good. We've been really good engineers for a really long time, and we still are. Look at the roster of Nobel Prize winners and the natural scientists, and look at the vast number of Americans that throng that distinguished list. Lots of them. And look at all the patents, all the discoveries, Silicon Valley to the chemical industry, on and on and on. It's amazing. We're really, really good at this. And you know one of the problems about being human is that when you're really good at something, you sort of say, well, I'm good at this, so I'll do this all the time. Right? To us, like hammers, always think everything's a nail. We think everything has a solution because if you want to build a bridge, there probably is a solution. If you want to figure out a better kind of software, there may very well be a solution. And so on. History isn't like this. It is not like there are solutions in the sense of once we figure it out, then it's over with. Once we know how to make a certain kind of software, well, we know how to do this. We've got it. History isn't like this. It's never over. We're dealing with humans. And instead of thinking of solutions, start, if you would, work on purging the concept of solutions from your mind in thinking about the subject matter of this class. Instead, think about what are strategies, what are ways of behaving, what are things we could do that would make things less bad. Now, this is not a message that a lot of young people like to hear, and I wonder about this, should I talk about this? But I don't think there's any way to avoid it. For my money, the art of politics at its best is the art of averting the very worst and the very most criminal outcome. It's that bad. I don't like, for example, a number of decisions that President Obama has made about Afghanistan, but at the same time, I am mindful of the difficulty of trying to dismount from a 2-ton tiger that is the military-industrial complex and living to tell the tale. How exactly you do this is difficult. Trying to avert the worst and stupidest is important because, as the last 8 years have shown, often we don't avert the worst and stupidest. Indeed, we rush to embrace it. So, try to get rid of this idea of solutions. Think instead, what can we do to make it a little less better, a little less difficult? Thomas Hobbes, one of the founders of modern political theory, once said that hell is truth seen too late. To avoid hell, let's open our eyes earlier, because there is a lot of hell out there. The things we are talking about in this class are not theories and are not theoretical. We will be using theories and theoretical ways to talk about it, but we are talking about mangled bodies. We are talking about dead people. We are talking about murder and mayhem that go on every day and show very little sign of stopping. And even as we're gathered here today, there are voices calling to expand wars. We need to understand this because this is going nowhere. We need to make sure that we're not silent. But if we're not going to not be silent, we must know what we're doing. We must know what we're talking about. We have got to make the effort to understand all of these forces such that people like this grieving mother have a little bit better chance. A long time ago, Albert Camus, great existentialist writer, who very much put his money, his body, where his mouth was. He was the editor of Combat, which was the French resistance underground newspaper during the Nazi occupation. The Gestapo would have shot him in a nanosecond if they'd been able to catch him. And he said, a vast conspiracy of silence has spread all around us. Conspiracy accepted by people who are frightened and who rationalize their fears to hide them, and a conspiracy fostered by those in whose it is their interest to do so. Our job is to listen to Camus and to not be silent, to not be part of this conspiracy, even if we're a little scared, to think clearly and speak up. Here's another way of thinking about the problem. There's another British journalist. We had a big opportunity in 9/11 and we massively blew it. And now we're trapped. We're trapped on the back of huge, ferocious beasts, and our political leaders can't seem to find a good way out of this. We need to think about this, because what they do and the steps that they take will affect your life. Your life will be shaped by these things, just as my life was shaped by choices made in Washington during the 1950s and 60s. Think about this. 30 years, as we'll see, we helped fund and finance the jihad against the Soviets in Afghanistan, starting in 1979, indeed a little before. Now, of course, we're fighting the same people that we armed, and everybody thinks this is perfectly sensible. Okay? The old children's story of the emperor has no clothes is something never to forget. Inside the Beltway in Washington, D.C., naked emperors parade up and down the Potomac. They go up and down Pennsylvania Avenue. And it's very good to have citizens around who say, look, the emperor's buck naked. Don't cheer at his wardrobe. Look at what's really going on here. And thinking about this and kind of what we're doing here, here's one of the greatest Americans of the 20th century, whose birthday is this month, said that history will have to record the greatest tragedy of this period of social transformation. He was talking about the civil rights period, but it's still true today. Not the strident clamor of the bad people, but the appalling silence of the good people. We don't want to be silent, but to not be silent, we must know what we're talking about, and we can do this together. Okay. What is this great transformation that I've been talking about? What is this, and how to think about it? It turns out, although it's possible to state the problem simply, analyzing it in a concrete situation is massively complicated. But let's start with the simple thing. What are the key themes here? This is a complicated and profoundly wrenching historical process. And the Middle East is right in the middle of it right now. It's a historical process in which changes in the patterns and levels of energy use play a fundamental role. By the way, all these slides are on ERES, all of them. Everything I put up here will be on ERES. It's a historical process which also involves changes in the nature of the state and of the international system of the states, and I might add, how people think, what political ideologies they adhere to. All of this is an enormously powerful, potent witch's brew. Where's this great transformation? First, let's just look at two dimensions of it. Economic and social, and political. Economic and social. We're talking about changing from a society that would have these characteristics. Before 1800, which in historical terms is really a blink of the eye ago, before 1800, every single society on the planet could be characterized like this. 90% of the people it varied. Tokugawa, Japan, maybe it was more like 80%. But most of the world, 9 out of 10 people were illiterate, and they were farmers or herders. Peasants nomads. They were not literate. They didn't read and write. They didn't go anywhere. They stayed in their village or whatever their patterns of movement, which were repeated over and over again. That was the large majority of people. Then these people were ruled in various ways by a small elite. This elite was typically divided into two pieces. There was what we might call an ideological elite. These were typically religious people, but not limited to it, particularly not in pre-industrial China. Okay? They were the people who could read and write. They were a small number of folks. And then there were the warriors, the violence specialists, the knights, the samurai, the people who could make you do what they wanted you to do, because if not, they would chop off your head. And we'll talk about this at great length. So that's where we start. Now just think, this is a deeply, profoundly different mode of life from the mode of life that we're familiar with. Today, most people overwhelmingly make their living from industry and services. Everywhere in the rich countries, this is overwhelmingly the case. The percentage of the labor force that is in agriculture is typically below 10%, or at least below 15%. It is a small minority of the population. Furthermore, unlike the old order, most people are literate. Now, as we're going to see in thinking about nationalism, this is huge. If people are going to be able to read and write, then there has to be some kind of an agreement about what the language is. Now, we in America don't think about this very much, but if you've ever been to places in Europe, you know that if you say you spend all this time studying a foreign language, let's say you study German, or you study French, or you study Spanish, and then you go out and travel around, and all of a sudden you say, well, wait a minute, they're not talking the way, because of all these dialects, right? All these local ways of speaking. What happened there? Well, we'll see. There's a whole process of interaction between the rise of the modern state and literacy and ideologies, which is hugely powerful, really important, and we're going to try to make some sense out of that. So literacy, a big deal. Most people live in cities. This is different. This is not the same. You don't know your neighbors necessarily. You don't know people like you did in the old days. This is very disorienting. There are shelves and shelves and shelves in every decent library about the social and psychological dislocations of rural to urban migration. It's gigantic. People come in and then they react because they're people just like us. So they reason and they think, and they think, whoa, how do I make sense out of this? What's going on? How can I think about this? This is so wrenching. This is so weird. And they start thinking. And there are other people who are disaffected, and they start thinking. And some of them are better at this than others, and ideologies are generated, and on we go. Okay? So we need to think about this. And governance. In Europe, before the beginning of the Great Transformation, nobody thought that anybody should have anything to do with governance except the military elite, and to some extent, depending on the place and time, the religious leadership. Nobody. Today, all over the world, as a result of this great transformation, people think that everybody somehow is going to be involved in governance. This is a gigantic change. It's huge. And it has huge implications. How you get from one place to another and what happens after that. Now, this man, Karl Polanyi, I didn't assign his book. It's a brilliant book. He coined the phrase the Great Transformation. He was a Hungarian refugee from fascism. And he wrote a brilliant book about the simultaneous rise of the market economy and the nation state. These things go together, and he talked about this. So the first transformation is this socio-economic change. And you'll notice that I couldn't talk about it without also talking about the state and about politics. But that's another thing we have to think about. There's the political. There's the rise of something called a nation state. We take nation states for granted. We take for granted that there is some geographical area which one state has sovereignty over. It has a flag. This is an entirely new idea in history, as we'll see. This had nothing to do with the way the world worked before the Great Transformation. And again, going from one system to another is deeply wrenching. This state is like the Roman god Janus, who faced in two directions at once. The Janus-faced state has a major task looking inside the society, as we'll see, figuring out ways to get enough revenue to pay for the violence specialists, the troops, and the bureaucrats to collect the taxes. And how you do that is a critical variable in understanding the process of state formation. We'll see this over and over again, and the role of oil, or the absence of oil, will be huge in thinking about this in this case of the Middle East. But it also faces external. The state, at the same time that it's trying to constitute itself, find ways to extract resources so that the basic cadre, the bureaucrats and soldiers of the state can be fed, housed, equipped, and kept loyal. At the same time, they're facing outward, dealing with other people doing the same thing who want to kill them and take it over. International conflict. States always are doing both at the same time. So we have to think about the Janus-faced nature of the state. This will become really, really clear in the cases of Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Saudi Arabia. In case after case, we will see this kind of process unfolding. Now, let's drop back a little bit and think a little more generally about, okay, we know some things to avoid, some pitfalls for Americans. We know one of the themes is this complicated process of the Great Transformation with its economic and social dimensions and also political dimension. What else do we need to think about? This may be breaking down an open door for you, I certainly hope so. But thinking causally is crucial. Actions have causes. This was not the line in the United States after 9/11. To talk about the causes of 9/11 was to invite charges of treason. Just because you can explain something doesn't mean you approve of it, but this obvious fact was lost. These actions which have causes also have consequences which are equally complicated. And the rule, rather than the exception in history, is unintended consequences are the norm. In other words, sometimes we Americans, with our engineering mind, think, well, they set out to do this and then they got this result, so how come they did that? Because we thought like that. We expected that what we wanted would then yield the outcome, but this is typically highly exceptional that you get that kind of outcome. Here's the greatest sociologist in history, Max Weber, who said that history is a web of unintended consequences. This is a hugely powerful way to think about social reality. Always, always think in terms of process. Everything is a process, and we need to think this. Here are 4 key concepts in thinking about social processes. First, contingency. Second, conjuncture. Third, overdetermination. And 4, contradiction. What do I mean? Let's take these one at a time. Contingency. This is really the idea of contingency is taken from Richard Rorty, the American pragmatist philosopher. And it's really a way of saying that we believe in causality. Phenomena arise and they disappear. Nothing lasts. Everything is impermanent. All of us and all of our institutions. The best way to think about any phenomena, namely why an oil price changed, why the United States bombed a certain place, why certain terrorists did what they did, is to think about the web of causes that led to this phenomenon. Indeed, it is a useful way to think about any phenomenon, including ourselves, as to think of ourselves as a web of causes. Here's Richard Rorty, the late American philosopher at the University of Virginia and Stanford, who basically said that historical circumstance goes all the way down. All of us are products of history. We think we can escape from time and chance, but this is most unlikely. He says we're animals, and one of the ways we cope is with language. I'm going to come back to this in just a second, because as we'll see, we have to understand ideologies, not just interests, in order to make sense of this. We've developed these clever ideas, and we need to make a distinction between the world and statements about the world. You know, people say that truth is out there. Well, the world is out there. But if truth means a statement about the world, a statement about the world is formulated in terms of human language, and there is no such thing as a private language. Right? Doesn't exist. Right? It's a language that's part of a social process. Consider an example. Consider the number 17. Suppose someone asks you, well, what is the essence of the number 17? I mean, what is it? I mean, apart from its relations to other numbers, I mean, okay, well, you say, well, 17, that's 10 plus 7. Or it's 23 minus 6. Or it's the square root of 289. Or it's the cube root of 4,913. Now, I don't do this in my head. Or it's 102 divided by 6, or you can go on and on and on forever. Because 17 is best thought of as a relation. And there is it can be described, we can describe these relations, but there's an infinite number of them. So how do we pick which relation to look at? That depends on the question we want to ask. Depends on our purposes. Okay? What determines these relations? Rory says, it doesn't pay to be an essentialist about numbers. To ask what is the essence of 17 is a ridiculous question. It is a meaningless question. Rory thinks, and I agree with him, that asking what is the essence of a society, what is the essence of violence in the Middle East, is an equally absurd and ridiculous question. It is not like that. It is rather a question of understanding the relations. Human beings, social institutions, wars, politics, ideology, economies, culture, all of it are best thought of as webs of relations. This is not a popular view in the United States, all right? People think that, well, that these bad guys are essentially this way. And the government of Iran is essentially this. And these terrorists in the hills are essentially that. Rubbish. It isn't like that. We may dislike what they do. I certainly do. But instead, they are, just like everything else, the product of webs of causes. And that's what we want to try to understand. So that's contingency. Always think this way. Essentialism is nonsense, in my view. It just doesn't make any sense. Certainly, this is the view of modern biology. Okay? There isn't any such thing as the essence of an animal. It is a complex, a process, in joined to other processes and other complexes. So too with society. What's this conjuncture idea? This goes back to a man named Fernand Braudel, famous French historian. Basically, think chemistry, not physics. What does this mean? If someone were to ask you, well, what's the essence of water? Is it hydrogen or oxygen? You say, where did they get these people? Yeah? I mean, it's both, right? It's H2O. I mean, it's the things coming together. History's like this, too. We have this tendency to look for a single explanation. Oh, it's just about oil. Oh, it's just about the Israel lobby. Oh, it's just about the military-industrial complex. Oh, it's just because George Bush was really, really annoyed about his father. What if it's all of the above? And the task is not to single out the single cause, but to find the pattern, to find the relationships that led to this. Two or more otherwise unrelated forces can come together at the same time to generate an outcome. This is what conjunction means. It's fundamentally opposed to monocausal thinking, and I think this is a very helpful thing to remember. Third thing, overdetermination. Another French idea. What is this idea about? Again, has the idea of multiple causality. But sometimes, indeed often, there are situations where really, when you have this conjuncture of multiple forces, it looks as if any one of them might have been enough to generate the result. But, in fact, they're both going on at the same time. This is what is meant by overdetermination. Here's an example. There are a series that we will trace of so-called price shocks in the in the history of the international oil crisis. The third of these that we will look at took place in the summer of 1986, when, in the space of a few days, the price of oil fell 40%. There's no doubt that the reason why this happened was a decision by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, but why did the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia make the particular decision they did? Well, there were political reasons, and there were economic reasons, and they were both present at the same time. And there was, in my judgment, a largely futile and unenlightening debate at the time and after by economic historians about, well, was it really this or really that? Well, you know, it was both. It was all of the above. It was these things coming together at the particular time. We need to ask, could it be that our peculiar decision to invade Iraq has a similar explanation? Multiple causes, just really, really rotten luck of having a whole bunch of things come together at the same time. What about contradiction? Fourth thing. There are different levels of contradiction. One is between what we see and what's actually happening, what we think we see and what's actually occurring. Among goals and values, it's not true that all good things are simultaneously available. All of us believe in justice, I would imagine, and all of us believe in compassion. And there are cases, for example, when the claims of justice and the claims of compassion will conflict. This is normal. It is not exceptional. And then last but not least, unintended consequences. Who are these guys? This is Isaiah Berlin, famous political philosopher in England, and that's John Gray, whose work you will be reading. The greatest political philosopher, in my judgment, of all time, Niccolò Machiavelli, said, in all human affairs, it is impossible to remove one inconvenience without another emerging. Okay, how do we analyze something that social scientists call agents? That's the economic term. Sometimes they're called social actors in sociology and political science. Here's a very simple preliminary first cut that I found really useful, and it's very helpful because it's simple, but it's also very rich. The first is interests, and the second is ideology. What do we mean? Interests. Never, ever underestimate the power of human greed. People pursue wealth, and people pursue power relentlessly. And we always have to pay attention to this. Always, if you want to explain any phenomenon, always ask the question that every detective always asks when faced with an unsolved crime. Who benefits here? Cui bono. To whom the benefit in this situation? How do they benefit from this? How do we understand this? So we must think about interests, always. Machiavelli again. I would say that this single quote may be the one quote that best summarizes the causes of wars throughout history. What is it? We relentlessly seek, we are relentlessly driven by this greed for wealth, for power. We are often thwarted. People are afraid to lose things. Other people want others. And enmities and wars are thereby begotten. Greed kills. But greed, whether for wealth or for power, although necessary, is not enough. We have to talk about ideas. Conceptual frameworks always matter. This is really pretty straightforward, right? I mean, there's just too much information out there in any situation. How do you even know what your interests are? Okay, given that I'm greedy, but how do I know? I know what I want to get, but how do I get it? I mean, what do I do? And there's all this information. I have to have a filter. What is that filter? What information do I retain? What do I ignore? What do I see? What do I not see? What matters? Why? What's perceived? What's ignored? One cannot understand social action without taking into account people's conceptual frameworks and therefore their ideology. You can no more understand the behavior of Benjamin Netanyahu by ignoring his ideology than we can understand the behavior of George Bush by ignoring his, or Osama bin Laden by ignoring his, or Saddam Hussein by ignoring his. We must pay attention to people's ideas and how they frame the world. The great English philosopher David Hume summed this up nicely. Although people are much governed by interest, but even interest is governed mainly by opinion. I mean, here's a good example. We can say at a very simple level, well, we invaded Iraq. Oh, I know, it's simple. It's because they wanted to get the oil. But who's they? Oh, the oil companies. But the oil companies haven't gotten very much oil. And at the time, a lot of members of the oil companies said, you know, we're happy to have you give us this on a platter, but you know what? We don't think you can do it. So, because why? Well, because it's been in our interest, and we've spent billions of dollars trying to understand this part of the world. We pay people a lot of money to do it, and they're telling us this isn't going to work out. So, opinion matters. But they did it anyway. What was Dick Cheney's opinions? In other words, Dick Cheney had a set of opinions about what he was doing. And those opinions, just to show that they were at variance with reality, well, yeah. But this is, again, the norm. We would expect this. So we always, over and over again, will be looking at the role of interests and the role of ideology and their interplay back and forth as a way to understand how history works. The now retired Kenneth Waltz, famous political scientist at Berkeley, said that, look, there are three levels. Individual level is kind of the psychological level, and that matters. And how states work. But then there's another independent level, which is the international state system, which changes over time. And we're going to have to spend attention, pay attention to this. We need to think about this. One perspective, another perspective, is the perspective of reproduction. This is a specific way of thinking about phenomena as webs of causes. We are social animals. In order to keep going, we relate to two things. We relate to non-human nature. We have to get food, we have to get clothing, we have to get shelter. And we also, as we do that, relate to each other. Ever since Karl Marx, or arguably even Adam Smith, social analysts in the West have been thinking of using this concept to try to understand the dynamics of history. How you think about it, the Great Transformation is a huge change in how we relate to nature and how we relate to each other as we try to create our lives. We need to think about this. Technology, social relations, how they relate to each other. Here's a perspective in the book that I wrote with my friend and colleague John Waterbury, formerly president of the American University in Beirut. Let's think of three processes here. Right? There's a whole process of economic growth, this great transformation up at the top. But then there are these social actors. What groups do we think? How do we aggregate individuals into groups? Is it social class? Is it business interests? I mean, is it work? I mean, how do we think about that? And then there's the state itself. We got to think about this. States in the modern world are driven by a growth imperative. We know in environmental studies how destructive that is. But it is nonetheless a fact that we can't ignore. There is an imperative of these states to grow. And this will matter to the history of the region that we're most particularly interested in. These transformations, all of them, require certain things. They require savings and investment. They require foreign exchange, which, simply put, is the ability to buy things from abroad. So if you think about it for a minute, you can see, look, if you're a society that's largely agricultural and you're trying to transform it, you meaning the state, trying to transform it into a state with industry, you've got to buy machines which you can't produce yourself. You've got to buy them from abroad. How do you buy them from abroad? Well, you've got to sell something to foreigners, so they'll sell you the machines. That's what foreign exchange is. How do you get it? Where do you get it? How do you organize it? Who's in charge of it? How does that work? And organization. All of this means the state matters. Now, next week, I'm going to start talking about state formation. And the state, I think, along with a lot of other social scientists, can't be reduced to social classes. This is, of course, arguable, and people have argued about it endlessly. But I think the state, particularly in the developing world, has a certain amount of autonomy. There's certain leeway, certain things they can do as it looks in and out, as it deals with its interests and its ideology. Who are these social actors? They're defined by ideology, or this is going to be a big deal, social movements. We will have to understand social movements because there is now in the region of the Middle East a powerful social movement. What are social movements? Well, things like the Civil Rights Movement was a social movement. The American Trade Union Movement was a social movement. The Communist Party of Italy was a social movement. The Nazis were a social movement. Fascism was a social movement. All of these were social movements. And today, in the Middle East, there is a very powerful, also heterogeneous social movement that most analysts in the West call Islamism. Notice, not Islam, not the religion of Islam, but a particular set of political ideas with a particular kind of speaking a particular kind of language, and understanding this social movement is essential to making sense out of blood and oil. These things interact with each other. In other words, this is interactive. What happens in the growth process throws up new social actors. To put it bluntly, going this way, some people win and some people lose. And the winners want to hold on to what they've got, and the losers don't like it, and they try to do something about it. Social conflict is thereby generated. Social actors can have some influence on the nature of this process. How much weight different groups have affects the whole pattern of growth. Social actors have an impact on the state. That's pretty obvious, right? I mean, there are all kinds of interest groups, all kinds of powerful people who have interests, who pursue these interests and have ideas about it, and they try to make the state do what they want. They're in competition with other people, and how that plays out varies. But it's also a reciprocal interaction, because social actors, even social classes, are not essences any more than anything else is an essence. They're the outcome of a process. They're the product of a web of circumstances, and one of those circumstances is what the state does. States can do things like expropriate big landlords. This happens over and over in human history. And in a stroke, they eliminate the power of certain social actors. So we care about this. And of course, state structures also influence the pattern of growth. Basic to the theory of economic development, policies matter to how fast you grow and what's the nature of the growth itself. And unintended consequences, which are the way everything in the world works, throw up problems to which the state must respond. So these things are fully interactive. Chapter 3 of the book that I wrote should be on reserve. The PDF is on reserve. At e-res, you can read all about this. This is one piece of the Great Transformation. We'll come to this later in the class, but this is what we're going to look at first. What I like to call the bloody triangle of modernity. 3 complicated processes. The rise of the modern state. Remember, modern states are not like pre-modern states. They're very different. They're much more capable, and they're much more lethal. Where did they come from? How are they formed? How can we think about this? We want to talk about that. One way to think about this is that here's one dimension of the Janus-faced nature of the state. In terms of the rise of the state, to anticipate, we'll be talking about how it is that certain specialists in violence manage to get, acquire, and hold a monopoly on that violence. This is the bottom line of what any state is about. How do they do this? Specifically, where do they get the money? How do you get the revenue to do it? How do you hold on to it? And how do you keep it? And as you do this, we're going to see that a particular ideology everywhere in the world, without exception, has accompanied this process, and that is the rise of this particular ideology. In the world, there are actually only 2 universal ideologies: consumerism and nationalism. That's all, folks. Oh, sure, there are great religions. They have many adherents. There was communism. It had a lot of adherents. Fascism had some. Democracy has some. But really, there are only 2 ideologies that you find everywhere in the modern world, and that's nationalism and consumerism. Now, how come? Why is this? Where did this come from? How to understand this? What are the web of causes that led to the rise of this particular profoundly essentialist ideology? Right? Nationalism is an essentialist ideology. It says we Americans are some kind of essential thing. Egyptians will say we are some kind of essential thing. Israelis will say we are some, and so on and so on and so on. Where did this come from? How to understand this? We got to do it. And we got to think about the other part of the Janus triangle here, about international state systems and imperialism. This is an amoral, violent world in which states seek to impose their will on other states, and they try to do this and use all kinds of means of violence. And to understand this process, both in Europe and then how it spills over and affects the Middle East, is a necessary background to understanding these things. Just as understanding, let's say, all you cared about was understanding the history of oil prices. Maybe you cared about nothing else. You only cared about what happened to prices. You could no more do this without understanding the Cold War than you could do it without understanding the Arab-Israeli conflict. It's impossible. So this process is also something we're going to care about. Now these processes, this web of causes, all of it, the socioeconomic transformation, the political transformation in its multiple dimensions, all of them required increasing energy use. Every single one of them. None of them occurred without increasing energy use, and that's what I'll talk about on Tuesday. And remember, the past is not dead. It is not even past. This class has now enrolled, as of 2 hours ago, maybe 3 hours ago, 190 people. There are 179 seats in here, and although we are trying to videotape these lectures, I hope this will happen. We're going to work on it. If you haven't gotten a permission code, then here's what I suggest you do. If you really want to take this class, just keep coming. And be polite, and keep reminding me. I really hate not letting students enroll in classes they want. If you're persistent, if you stick with it long enough, I may find a way to give you a permission code. We also have to keep the fire marshal happy. Have a great weekend, and I'll see you on Tuesday.
Some say that mankind won't long endure, but what makes them feel so doggone sure? I know that you who hear my singing could make those freedom bells go ringing. I know that you who hear my singing could make those freedom